Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, you've just stumbled onto a story that's going to absolutely blow your mind. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for coming back. You guys keep me going. Real quick before we dive in, if you end up enjoying this video, do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It really helps the algorithm show this to more people who love weird history as much as we do. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because trust me, we've got some wild ones coming up. Also, share this with a friend who loves bizarre historical facts. This is definitely one of those you won't believe this actually happened stories that makes for great conversation. All right, I know you're wondering what today's story is about. Let me just say this. We're about to talk about one of the most unbelievable medical practices in history. Something that went on for over 70 years, involved millions of women, was performed by the most respected doctors of the time. And yet somehow, nobody realized what was actually happening. Sound impossible? Stick around. Let's get into it. You know what's wild about history? Sometimes the most shocking stories aren't about what people did intentionally. They're about what they did without even realizing it. Picture this. London, 1880s. A woman sits in a doctor's office, hands shaking, completely exhausted. She can't sleep. She's irritable. She feels like she can't breathe properly. At a dinner party last week, she had what she describes as some kind of attack. Her whole body tensed up, she got flushed, and she had to leave the room. She's already seen 2 doctors. They gave her some bitter medicine that didn't help. But this 3rd doctor, he's different. He's confident. He knows exactly what's wrong with her. Hysteria, he says, like he's solved a mystery. Now here's where things get absolutely bizarre. He tells her that her uterus, yeah, we're going there, is basically throwing a tantrum because it's not getting what it needs. And he has a treatment, a hands-on treatment. She goes behind a screen, changes, lies down on a leather table. The doctor applies some lavender oil and begins, let's call it a medical procedure. He's rubbing, pressing, working in circular motions. And then, boom. Her body convulses, she gasps, she grips the table, and experiences what we would immediately recognize today as an orgasm. But here's the kicker. Neither she nor the doctor will ever call it that. Because according to Victorian medicine, respectable women don't have sexual feelings. It's literally impossible. So what just happened? Just a hysterical paroxysm, a medical event, nothing sexual about it. The doctor writes in his notes like he just checked her blood pressure. Excellent response. See you next Thursday. And she leaves, feeling amazing, but having no idea why. If you're as fascinated by how spectacularly wrong smart people can be, stick around, because this story gets so much weirder. So where did this whole mess start? We need to go way back, like ancient Greece back. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, the guy doctors still quote today, looked at women having seizures and anxiety and came up with an explanation that honestly sounds like he was just making stuff up. Their uterus was wandering around inside their body. I'm serious. He thought that if a woman wasn't married, if she wasn't having regular sex and getting pregnant, her uterus would literally get bored and start traveling around her torso like a lost puppy, bumping into other organs and causing all kinds of problems. Plato took it even further. He described the uterus as an animal within an animal. Like there's a separate creature living inside women that has its own desires and gets angry when it doesn't get what it wants. The cure seemed obvious to them. get married, have babies, keep that uterus happy and in its place. Now fast forward to the Renaissance. Doctors start doing dissections, and guess what they discover? The uterus doesn't actually move around. It's anchored in place. Mystery solved, right? Wrong. Here's where it gets really weird. They kept the diagnosis anyway. Instead of saying, "Oh, we were completely wrong about the wandering womb thing," they just shifted the explanation. Well, maybe it's not wandering, but there's still something about the female reproductive system that makes women unstable. By the Victorian era, hysteria could mean basically anything. Can't sleep? Hysteria. Too emotional? Hysteria. Not emotional enough? Also hysteria. Too interested in sex? Hysteria. Not interested in sex? Believe it or not, also hysteria. One doctor estimated that 75% of women suffered from it. Let that sink in. 3 out of every 4 women had a disease that could manifest as literally any symptom. That's not a medical condition. That's just being a woman in a society that pathologized female existence. By the mid-1800s, doctors had figured out their treatment protocol, pelvic massage. The theory was straightforward in their minds. If the uterus was causing all these nervous symptoms, they needed to calm it down by inducing a hysterical paroxysm through direct stimulation. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually worked, because it's important to understand just how systematic this was. A woman would make an appointment, often weekly, sometimes twice a week. She'd arrive at the doctor's office, go behind a screen, and undress from the waist down. Crucially, her face would be covered with a sheet. Both doctor and patient could pretend this wasn't really happening if they couldn't see each other's faces. The doctor would prepare his oils, lavender and rose were popular, and begin the massage. Broad strokes at first, then increasingly focused, finding sensitive areas, building intensity. Some appointments took over an hour. The doctor would work until the woman experienced what they clinically described as violent contraction and relaxation of the muscles, flushing of the face, feeling of heat, copious discharge of secretions, followed by profound relief. That is a medical textbook description of an orgasm. But they never called it that. One doctor, writing in his journal, actually complained about how exhausting this treatment was. He said it could take an hour and a half of continuous manual stimulation, making it among the most tedious medical procedures. He was literally complaining about how tiring it was to give women orgasms, and he had absolutely no idea that that's what he was doing. The scale of this is mind-blowing. In major cities, some doctors specialized exclusively in hysteria treatment. They became wealthy doing it. Their appointment books were packed months in advance. Some women appear in these records every single week, for years, decades even. And it wasn't just in doctors' offices. Wealthy women could arrange house calls. But the really fancy option, hydrotherapy spas in Europe, where they'd use pressurized water jets instead of hands. Places like Bath in England and Baden-Baden in Germany marketed themselves as luxury destinations for treating female nervous complaints. Women would travel across Europe to spend weeks at these resorts, receiving multiple treatments per day. And of course, they felt amazing afterward. They'd write testimonials about feeling invigorated beyond measure and returning home with remarkable restoration of spirits. Yeah, I bet they did. Here's what absolutely breaks my brain about this whole situation. The sheer cognitive dissonance required to make this work. These weren't fringe quacks operating out of back alleys. These were respected physicians trained at prestigious medical schools. They published papers in medical journals. They lectured at universities. They were considered the best doctors of their time, and they would spend their afternoons inducing orgasms in female patients. write detailed clinical notes about the muscle contractions and flushing and secretions, and then go home to wives they genuinely believed had zero sexual desire. Victorian medical doctrine was crystal clear on this. Respectable women didn't have sexual feelings. Dr. William Acton, one of the most influential doctors of the era, published his expert opinion that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This became medical fact. A woman who admitted to sexual desire was considered abnormal, possibly dangerous, definitely not respectable. So these doctors would perform what is obviously a sexual act, witness an obvious sexual response, and their brains would just not connect the dots. Because connecting those dots would mean admitting that everything they'd been taught about women was wrong. The denial was built into the system at every level. Medical schools didn't teach about the clitoris, or they'd mention it briefly as a vestigial organ with no real function. Students graduated from top medical schools without learning that this part of female anatomy had any purpose. The examination rooms were designed to maintain the fiction. The sheet covering the face, the clinical language, the medical instruments on display, the mahogany walls and leather furniture, everything screamed, "This is medicine, not sex." And women? They couldn't articulate what was really happening either. To admit it felt good, to acknowledge it was sexual, would mean admitting they had sexual desires, which would make them unrespectable, which would make them the problem. So everyone just agreed not to notice the obvious. Then came the problem that would change everything. The doctors' hands were getting tired. By the 1880s, some physicians were treating dozens of women per week, sometimes for over an hour each. That's a lot of repetitive motion. They were developing serious hand and wrist problems, arthritis, inflammation, genuine pain. Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville, a London physician, was facing this exact problem. His hands were giving out, so he did what any clever inventor would do. He mechanized the process. In 1883, he developed a device called the percussor, an electromagnetic vibrator that could produce rapid vibrations at adjustable speeds. Let the machine do what the hand had been doing, but faster and with less effort. Granville insisted his device was meant for treating male muscle disorders. But doctors working with female patients immediately saw the application. Why spend an hour when you could achieve the same result in 10 minutes? The technology spread like wildfire. By 1900, there were dozens of manufacturers producing vibrators. The Weiss Company catalog offered over 20 different models. There were handheld versions, floor models, devices that attached to furniture, specialized chairs with built-in vibrating mechanisms. And here's where it gets truly surreal. These devices started being sold directly to consumers. The 1908 Sears catalog, the Amazon of its day, featured home vibrators right alongside toasters and sewing machines. The ad copy promised they were very useful and satisfactory for home service. Women's magazines ran advertisements showing women using vibrators on their faces with text about "Vibration is life" and "The secret of the ages." They were marketed as health devices, efficiency tools, modern conveniences for the scientifically minded household. By 1915, the vibrator was the fifth most common electrical appliance in American homes, more common than electric fans, more common than electric irons in many places. And still, nobody admitted what they were actually for. Husbands would buy them for their wives as gifts, therapeutic devices to help with her nerves. Women would use them regularly, sometimes with medical recommendations to do so. Everything was wrapped in the language of health and vitality and nervous restoration. The cognitive dissonance reached its peak with figures like John Harvey Kellogg. Yes, the cornflakes guy. He ran a sanitarium where he treated hysteria with vibrators and electrical devices. At the same time, He was crusading against masturbation as a moral evil. He wrote extensively about how self-pleasure would destroy you. He even advocated for surgical procedures to make masturbation more difficult. He never connected what he was doing medically with what he was warning against morally. In his mind, if a doctor did it for medical reasons, it was healing. If a woman did it to herself for pleasure, it was depravity. So what finally broke through this elaborate system of denial? Pornography. I'm not kidding. In the 1920s, as moving picture technology evolved, underground films started circulating, what they called stag films. These were explicit, illegal, crude, sexual films for male audiences. And some of these films featured women using vibrators for obviously sexual purposes. The moment vibrators appeared in pornographic films, everything changed. The device that had been respectable, medical, advertised in family magazines, suddenly became associated with explicit sexuality. And that association was impossible to ignore. If vibrators were being used for sex in pornography, then what exactly had doctors been doing with them in their offices? The question didn't even need to be asked out loud. The answer was suddenly, horrifyingly obvious. Within just a few years, vibrators essentially disappeared from medical practice. The Sears catalog dropped them by 1925, not gradually, just gone. Medical journals stopped featuring them. Doctors quietly disposed of the devices sitting in their offices. The practice that had been standard medical treatment for decades became taboo practically overnight. The speed of this transformation tells you everything. The technology didn't change. The function didn't change. What changed was that the sexual nature of what was happening could no longer be denied. It took pornography, the most stigmatized, most socially condemned form of media, to break through the layers of medical and cultural pretense. The irony is almost too perfect. Hysteria as a diagnosis hung around until 1952, when it was finally removed from psychiatric manuals. But it never regained its prominence. The diagnosis that had affected millions of women, that had driven a massive industry, essentially vanished. But its legacy didn't. The term hysterical became shorthand for dismissing women's concerns. Women's pain continued to be minimized, their symptoms attributed to anxiety or emotion rather than investigated seriously. It wasn't until the 1960s that researchers like Masters and Johnson actually studied female sexuality scientifically. And what did they find? Exactly what Victorian women knew but couldn't say: that the hysterical paroxysm was simply an orgasm. Everything documented in those medical journals, the muscle contractions, the flushing, the rapid breathing, the relief, it was all just a textbook description of female sexual response. Let's talk about the scale of what actually happened here, because the numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that if just 10% of adult women in major cities received hysteria treatment between 1850 and 1920, and they averaged 20 sessions each over their lifetimes, we're talking about tens of millions of medically administered orgasms, possibly hundreds of millions. Some women received treatment weekly for decades. Some went twice weekly. Some traveled to European spas and received multiple treatments daily for weeks. This wasn't a marginal practice. This was mainstream medicine, affecting an enormous portion of the female population, performed by respected physicians in elite practices. And the most striking part? How the entire medical profession participated without recognizing what was happening. These weren't stupid people. They had detailed anatomical knowledge, years of training, direct experience with human bodies, but they remained blind because the culture around them had constructed such an elaborate framework of denial around female sexuality. The blindness wasn't accidental. It was systematic. Medical textbooks omitted the clitoris or dismissed it as useless. Educational curricula didn't mention female pleasure. Professional terminology allowed doctors to describe sexual acts in purely clinical language. Even the architecture of examination rooms maintained the fiction, the sheet placement, the covered face, the clinical positioning. Everything allowed both parties to pretend nothing sexual was occurring, and professional consensus made it all possible. When all your colleagues are doing the same thing, when medical journals publish articles about it matter-of-factly, when prestigious institutions teach it, questioning the practice seems unnecessary. The power of peer consensus to blind people to obvious truths cannot be overstated. But here's the thing. Some women understood. The evidence is scattered through diaries and letters. One woman wrote in 1892, "My weekly appointments have quite restored my spirits. I find myself looking forward to Thursday afternoons with great anticipation, though I couldn't explain why." Another noted that the treatment provides a relief unlike any tonic or medicine prescribed to me. Women recommended their doctors to each other. Networks formed. Certain physicians became known among women as particularly effective. Some maintained waiting lists with dozens of women requesting appointments. The demand wasn't coming from doctors pushing treatment. Patients were actively seeking it out, maintaining appointments over years, sometimes decades. For women whose sexuality had been systematically denied, whose bodies had been taught to them as instruments of reproduction rather than sources of pleasure, this treatment represented something extraordinary. It was the only space in their lives where their bodies received this kind of attention, where something that felt undeniably good was happening, even if it couldn't be named. Then it ended, not because their condition was cured, there was no condition to cure, but because society's willingness to maintain the pretense collapsed. Women who had structured their weeks around these appointments, who had found relief and pleasure there, suddenly found themselves without access. The doctors didn't explain why they were stopping. They just stopped. The cultural amnesia was nearly total. Within a generation, the fact that doctors had routinely treated women with genital stimulation was treated as almost unbelievable. But the women remembered. Some wrote about it later in guarded language. Others never spoke of it, carrying the memory as private understanding of something the world insisted wasn't real. So why does this history matter? Because it reveals something crucial about how medicine works. Medical practice isn't immune to cultural bias. It isn't protected by scientific training from the assumptions of the society it exists within. Brilliant, educated, well-intentioned professionals can be so blinded by cultural consensus that they perform the same action thousands of times without recognizing its true nature. The treatment of hysteria represents perhaps history's most elaborate example of collective denial. But it's not unique. Throughout medical history, pain has been systematically minimized, symptoms dismissed, treatments denied, because they contradicted cultural beliefs about what certain people should want or need. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Somewhere in modern medicine right now, there are almost certainly equivalent blind spots. Things happening regularly, discussed in professional literature, performed by educated practitioners that future generations will look back on with the same bewilderment we feel about Victorian hysteria treatment. We probably can't see what they are. That's the nature of cultural blindness. But they are there. The next time someone dismisses a medical complaint as just anxiety or just stress, remember this history. For over 2 centuries, the medical profession performed a sexual act while maintaining that female sexuality didn't exist. Reality doesn't wait for our permission to exist. The fact that everyone involved maintained this was medicine doesn't mean it wasn't something else entirely. The vibrator's journey from respected medical device to taboo sexual implement and back reveals how fragile medical legitimacy can be. The device didn't change. What changed was the cultural context and what people were finally willing to admit. This history teaches us to question authority, to challenge consensus, to resist the comfortable fiction that expertise equals understanding. Because sometimes, the most obvious truth is the one nobody wants to see. So here's the takeaway. Even the most educated professionals can miss the obvious when cultural assumptions cloud their vision. It happened for 70 years in Victorian medicine, and it's probably happening somewhere in our world today. The question is, are we paying attention? If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We dive deep into historical mysteries like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Share this video with someone who appreciates real history, the kind they don't teach in textbooks, and drop a comment below. What do you think our modern blind spots are? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.